Welcome back from afternoon tea, everyone, or as my Ngunnawal friends would say, yalla, g'day. My name is Rosemary and I'm the Children and Families Programs producer here at the NGA, and I'm here to introduce our featured artist who's speaking this afternoon. Sally Smart is a leading contemporary artist, recognised across Australia and indeed internationally. Her large-scale installation work involves assemblage, cutouts, collage, and increasingly live performance and moving imagery. Sally's contribution to our cultural landscape is perhaps reflected in the accolades and awards, which are as numerous as they are well-deserved. A trip to sallysmart.com will provide a much better list, and much more accurately than I'm willing to attempt here today. Sally is interested in complex and inspired by things that have been feeding her practice for decades, and it is perhaps her ongoing interest in the ballet russe, which is why I'm here to introduce her today. NGA Play, which is downstairs, features at the moment an absolutely magical installation which looks at Sally's inspiration from the ballet russe collection that's held here in the National Gallery. We have one of the most significant surviving collections of ballet russe costumes in the world. It was an absolute privilege to work with Sally for about 12 months in the lead up to the delivery of that exhibition. And while I hope to top that, I suspect it'll remain a career highlight for me till the day I die. So, it is with absolute pleasure that I welcome Sally Smart to talk to us this afternoon.
Hi, and it's great to be here. I can see some familiar faces actually, because I gave a talk in Victoria last year, and I must say that I'd just like to. Result of that talk last year, I had so many wonderful letters and Instagram posts from teachers who sent me images of things that they had done with their classes. So I really appreciated it, actually. It was really wonderful, and it was quite extraordinary, the work that was made. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet today as well, past, present and future. Today I'll talk very quickly about my work. My practice is sort of yearly getting more and more dense somehow, so there's sort of lots to go through, but so many things I don't want to leave out, so it's really hard. So the one thing has to go, and that is like I have to work faster, talk quicker, and you have to watch quicker as well. So I'll go through lots of images, and I won't talk to all of them, but I'll talk to a lot of them. And then I want there to be time for everyone to get onto their workshop afterwards, and also for questions at the end as well. I'll divide it very much into my practice more generally, and work that is more recent, that is sort of contextualises the NGA play project and then the actual project. So I've pretty much divided it into three parts. So here we go. The first image I'll put up is, I guess, over a long period of working, one of the significant areas of my practice is cutting. And in the early, if you like, 90s, I actually started to develop big body of work around cutting, collage and assemblage. And this work actually represents a work of myself with my organs on the outside. When I did this work, I didn't really know where all my organs were in my body, I realised after many years of art school. And I thought, well, why don't I just make them and then put them on the body? And it's also really interesting to see the Annette Massager work here at the National Gallery of Australia, because she was quite influential to me at this particular period of time. And so I can't quite remember whether I saw her organs or not, or whether I decided this, how I did this. But anyway, there they are, pinned onto my body. And it became quite a well-known self-portrait. And then the other work next to it is the anatomy lesson, the very, very first assemblage construction work that I ever did. And that was in 1993-94. So from these bodies of work, I really, everything has grown, if you like. So often looking at metaphors and building a body of work around ideas. So this was around looking at the body and the inside of the body and the outside of the body and how it was constructed. At the same time, this work was also, I started to develop the idea of cutting and to cut more radically. So cutting to construct elements, to assemble with pins, pinned onto a wall of my studio in this case, or onto a gallery wall. This was a family tree house that was in a sort of a construction that really not only was about the family tree as this sort of idea that was, but also an imaginary idea of the family tree. And it wasn't just the things that you might have inherited through genetics, but also ideas and emotional ideas and psychological ideas and historical ideas. And this all culminated in 2002 with a finale of a work here, which is in the collection of the National Gallery of Australia. And it's around about 11 metres high, so a really, really large work. And you can see by the relationship there of where that person is standing as to how big the work is. So it literally was built like building and climbing a tree. From that body of work of trees, there's a sort of big part of my work, the sort of language of trees. I grew up in the far north of South Australia in the Flinders Ranges, so trees were a very significant part of my life. And when we were very young, we used to have to sleep on the verandas at night, which were quite spooky, if you can imagine, for a child with all the trees around. But later, here in 2014, I'm sort of constructing a massive big tree in Melbourne, in Docklands, and it became the shadow trees. In the mid-2000s, I did a body of work called The Exquisite Pirate. And I think some of you will know this work. This work really centred on me thinking about the woman artist pirate in the end. It didn't start off like that. I took my young child to a kids' animation, came out, asked the question, looked up on Google, were there any women pirates? And I found that actually there were significant numbers of women pirates in the world, and there had been through history. Of course there were, and women are in all parts of human history and often get written out of human history. So I started to make a body of work around the woman pirate. I used a trip to Darwin actually in 2004 as the sort of jumping off point really for how I might image this body of work. I decided to focus on the ships first, and I had seen this sort of art gallery and museum in Darwin where a lot of the ships were shown, and a lot of them had scarification, some were textiles, on the sails. And so I started to make a big body of work, in a post-colonial sort of discourse around the ship. It's a very, very powerful one. And I actually started to embody the ship as almost as, because the ship is always she, and to embody the ship in very much a feminized sort of state, but with constructions of made textiles. So I made the whole body of work also follow a trajectory of around the flag in blue, red and white. And there were variations of that in terms of the blood and water, but also thinking of the flag, the Australian flag as well. At the same time, politically in Australia, there was the Tampa issue, and so it became quite a poignant sign for me. And then I exhibited this work, firstly in Richmond, Virginia, and then this grew. I took it actually in my suitcase because a lot of my work all folds down. It's actually not paper. A lot of people think it's paper. It's actually very, very little paper. Mainly all the work is textile or painted canvas and folded. And I took the whole body of work to Richmond, Virginia in a suitcase. And I was sort of really nervous about the body of work actually, because the pirate's such a sort of cliche, and the Pirates of the Caribbean was just on the horizon at that point. So I was sort of, there was some trepidation about it. And I remember arriving at Richmond, Virginia, and with this suitcase, and it was an exhibition I'd met with a curator, a New York curator I'd met in Korea, I think about 5 years before, and put me in this international exhibition called Surface Charge, where everything had to do with the wall. And I originally put up a grid, and you can see that the grid is often used, or the one on the bottom far side is the grid. I would use that in a sort of sense of gridding up the space, but also sort of colonising the space as well. And when it came, I actually just put up the grid, and everyone thought that was the work. And then overnight, I put all the ships and the pirates in, and the whole thing just exploded in this huge body of work. And as a consequence of that, actually, the gallery I started to work with in New York, and then I actually worked on this body of work for about 4 years, and ended up showing in about over 4 years in 10 different countries and about 30 different exhibitions. So the Exquisite Pirate opened up the world for me in all sorts of incredible ways, and primarily it was sent in my suitcase. So I actually, in the end, was the pirate taking booty across, continents and art in suitcases. I also make works on paper always, and I make them always the same size, and I make them before a body of work and after a body of work. It's a way of contextualising the idea and maybe experimenting with my ideas either at the end of a series or at the beginning. It's quite formal, actually, this process. And I actually showed 100 of them, and they were over about 12, 15 years work, but they had an amazing consistency in terms of the way they sat together when they actually were exhibited. I guess it's the late 2000s, I started to, after The Exquisite Pirate and a number of other works, I started to really consider the idea of space and making my work in space. And I'd been working on these large-scale installations for a number of years, and I started to think about choreographers and movement a lot more seriously in relation to me making art and how my body moved in space when I made my elements. So I started to look at choreographers' drawings as a way into this, and initially I found that when I did a study of choreographers' drawings, that actually a lot of them made their drawings the way I made my work, actually. So this was in my studio, was a sort of a board, on the board, a Pina Bausch performer works, photographs of her company, various drawings, and also early modernist women artists who have always been a great influence on my work. So I started to look at the choreographers' drawings and to sort of think about how they would describe movement through moving notations. And I also looked at Martha Graham, and I started to use the elements that I made, almost like the cut-out figures that I made, and incorporating dance elements inside those cutouts, pinning them, and then also if you like, gridding up once again the space and defining the space. In 2012, did a workshop at the University of Connecticut and did a body of work called the Pedagogical Puppet. By this stage, I'm showing regularly in New York, and one of the curators saw my work and invited me to do a residency. The residency was to work with the School of Animation and Puppetry and learn some animation and puppetry. And previously I had made puppets when my son was born in 1996, and I had based them on the Dada puppets, Dada doll puppets, and the puppets, I call them the women of the revolution. So they all were the constructivist artists, and it's really wonderful to see the exhibitors upstairs here at the gallery. And also, when I was making these puppets, I also wanted to embody them somehow with photo montage, because I'm very interested in the work of Hannah Hock. And Hannah Hock made dolls for the very first Dada exhibition. They are sort of like artifacts of performance, if you like, and also very and have a very strong connection to the woman artist of the avant-garde. I made a couple of portraits of Hannah Hock, and I was also interested in Sophie Taube. And at the same time as looking at her, I found that through Laban, the great choreographer, and Steiner, the philosopher, who was a teacher of Sophie Torp-Arp, that they all made drawings around choreography and puppets as well. And so these are some of my sort of full-size puppets. And when I was in the University of Connecticut, I decided to have a blackboard. I had a residency there, so I had a studio, and I said, can you paint? It was also then turned into a gallery at the end of the residency. And I said, can you paint one of the walls black? I'd like to make it a sort of, I'm the pedagogical puppet. I'm the puppet, I'm the puppet to learn about puppetry, but I'm also, so we used this title of the pedagogical puppet as who was the puppet, me or them or all of us. And it was the content, very much the content of the body of work I made. But so I said every lecture or every note or every discussion that I might have with the lecturers there and the academic staff, I would just make a note and put it onto this blackboard. So I was sort of, in the lineage of Boys, in the lineage of the blackboard, in the lineage of Steiner. I was referencing all of those sorts of anyone who's ever used the blackboard in the history of art, and there is a lot of use of the blackboard. But I literally used it, and I used it as a mechanism to retain information, but also as a space of putting the information. I also made, I didn't make the puppet actually, I asked them to make a puppet for me, and I had seen a photograph of Einstein. The Yale puppeteers had made a photograph of Einstein, had made a puppet of Einstein, so I asked them if they would make a puppet of me, and they did, which was great. And so we did a portrait, actually, and that's it's a portrait that I had constructed, and then it was shown in an exhibition with Maurizio Catalan's Mini-Me portrait as well. And so from the blackboard, a whole body of work grew, and this is one of the works. So not only from those very beginnings with the blackboard, I also then started to use the blackboard as a very much a tool for my own thinking and my own process, referencing process, referencing ideas, making connections. And then the whole thing started to grow into a very large project where I also then started to incorporate video work, the puppets I made, the puppets in the front of the work that I made. And then in 2014, and this was, I was in the Dark Heart, the Adelaide Biennial, and I did a full room blackboard work, which also sort of had a filmic sort of element to with the white space. And then once again, I did another work here, which is actually in the National Gallery of Australia's collection. And sometimes I do these blackboards on a painted black wall, and sometimes I do them on a black canvas, which I can do in my studio and then roll up and take. And so there are all the notes, and at about this time I also started collaborating with Maria Tamarkin, a cultural historian, and she started to write some poetry and some words for me. We would have discussions. So I'm always interested in extending and collaborating actually with other people, and this very much started with the Choreography of Cutting body of work. In about 2013, I did these shows all around the world really, and this one is in London, and you can see it's started to fragment in a way, the blackboard. But now I'm sort of incorporating the notes, and I'm incorporating the text, and I'm incorporating the figurative elements. A lot of these elements are constructed by me with models, and some of them are found. As a consequence of this, I actually then, I found that Marni, the fashion brand, they wanted to do a collaboration with me whereby they were starting to cut up my work, and it was ironic because at the same time I started to cut up the costumes of the Ballet Russe. That was pretty interesting, and we'll come back to that in a minute. In 2005 I was in the Jogja Biennale in Indonesia, but I was in America at the time and I couldn't go. Later on, Entang Wahaso, an Indonesian artist, came to Melbourne, and he was asked who would he like to meet. He said Sally Smart, because he'd helped install my sort of fragmented, exquisite pirate work in the Biennale, and because I wasn't there. And we met, and then we became friends, and he invited me to work with him in Indonesia, and I did at his studio, and we put on this exhibition at the National Gallery of Indonesia in Jakarta in 2016. And we actually opened on the day of the Jakarta bombing. But the next day, there was an outpouring of people coming to the exhibition, and it was one of the, I think, the second highest attendance ever in the history of the National Gallery of Indonesia. And it was the first time a woman artist, a Western woman artist, had been shown with an Indonesian artist. So it was a really fantastic moment, and also consolidated a very strong friendship. It was called Conversation, Endless Acts in Human History. And so with a title like that, of course, it was sort of, quite an extraordinary thing to have a bombing on that day. But anyway, it went on to be really successful. And during the project, Entang had about 10 people working for him, and I had nobody. So I started to made my own studio in Yogyakarta as well, and I still continue to this day maintain that studio and studio assistants. I also did work with puppets, which actually had an Indonesian influence to them, because I had long been interested in the puppet and the shadow puppet and the wayang kulit, and this way I was able to incorporate elements, and I actually for the very first time started to make them move on small motors. And then in Yogyakarta, I exhibited in 2017 one of the large works where I started to look at the ballet russe. This was called Performance, Pinocchio and Trickster and 30 Puppets. And I also worked with Harry Dono, a major Indonesian artist, and you would know his work here in the collection of the National Gallery of Australia. And we did a workshop together, and it was absolutely brilliant, and was at his studio. And we were with 10 international artists who were all resident in Yogyakarta at the time, and we all made these puppets, and this was our finale. I started to look at the ballet russe again seriously in about around this time. I thought when I had more skills around the digital, I started to cut up the costumes that I could find online, the ballet russe costumes. And I digitally cut them up, and then I reconstructed them, because I was able to use Eko Nugroho's studio. The artisans in Indonesia were really incredible studios of artisans that they had. I had done some with some Vietnamese artisans previously, but they just didn't quite translate as the way I wanted them to. And so when I was able to have my studio in Indonesia, I was able to, in Jogja, I was able to control the whole system a little better. And so we started to make these digital, if you like, digital drawings that I had, and then I'd have them made into a costume. So they'd go pretty much straight from my computer to a photocopy, and then be manually made. And when I started to receive them back, I realised that the Indonesian language in these costumes was theirs. It was so familiar, and yet they were absolutely from the ballet russe. And so I started to look at the whole situation through colonialism around Orientalism, and look at what had been going on in the East and Russia. And of course the ballet russe were primarily based in Paris, but were Russian artists that were working with, as were also Picasso and Sonia Delaunay and amazing other artists. So these are some of the costumes that I started to create, embroideries. And in the beginning they were quite shrunken, and then gradually over some development we started to make them full size, and they were just flat, but they are all from bits of ballet russe costumes, but not completely ballet russe costumes, because they're also constructions that we've made. And then I started to incorporate these into the larger body of work. This was an exhibition in New York in 2016 as well. And they just started to exist as these sort of sculptural objects, firstly, and some of them had extensions on them. Some of them almost were like extensions of an instrument or something. About, some of the discourse around the ballet russe was that a lot of the costumes couldn't be very well worn anyway, because they were so heavy, and the dancers were cutting themselves. And so I started to think about all of this embodiment, and also the embodiment of other culture within these constructions. These are based on the Picasso's Parade, and these exist as photographs in the Victorian and Albert Museum in London. And all we have of those are the actual photographs. So I took the photographs and worked with the artisans, but they turned them into almost camouflage because they were so pixelated, my files, because I got them off the web, that they turned them into camouflage horses because it's a pretty common fabric textile. And so it was this interpretation that I became quite interested in as well. And then in 2017, I had the opportunity to install in South Australia an installation where I had developed the backdrops of a particular performance called Shoot, the Buffoon. This one is the most interesting to me of many of the Ballet Russe ballets. It's called the Buffoon, and it's Larinov and Goncharova, and they were partners. And there's a lot. When I was developing this work, I just had this very strong feeling about, because I was working in Indonesia, I was very connected. People kept saying, "Where does it fit, though, Sally? I mean, really? How do you? I can see this and I can see that, but." And I was pushing forward with this. I just had this really, really strong feeling about, one, of course, there was the imagery that was so known to the Indonesian artisans that had come from the East, and a lot of the Ballet Russe were using their East as being Russian East, but also using for their content, their stories, the Middle East, and also in China as well. And so there were all these sorts of mixed up references. But I thought there was more to it. There was something about the cubist space. There was something about the European performance, ballet dance. It's about lifting up off the ground. It's about using the body in a space in a different way. In Javanese dance, it's about it's like the puppet. It's an interpretation of the wayang, the shadow puppet. So it's horizontal. It's parallel to the wall, and so there are all of these things that were sort of clues to me about how I might, how I felt about it, and why I felt it was very strongly embedded there. Anyway, I have since found out, and only very recently, that actually, and I read it, that Larinova was interested in Indonesian puppetry. So I knew it, and I knew it was there. And it's one of those things about making art that you have this smell about something, and you just keep drilling into it. You're not quite sure, but it's strong, and it's like it's there, and you're in these two places, and it's sort of calling out to you. And this was really, really, really strong feeling in this body of work. 2017, I then started to work with Brooke. We had actually done a few things previous to this time, but I started to work with Brooke Stamp, the dancer, and we started to then, I started to put Brooke very much into my work and perform with the costumes. And here was a body of work that I did that also went to Rome in 2017. And at that time, it was also the centenary of Parade being performed, and Picasso, or Parade being a Picasso meeting Diaghilev. So it was incredible timing. And once again, the puppets, and this is work that I just did recently in Indonesia. And so this is all the background work to coming up to the body of work with the working with NGA Play. So that was the background. So here I am. I'm invited to do this, to do this project here, and I decide to make the work. It's got to be contextualised through my work, but I'm not actually making art. So that's the conundrum in a way. So there's none of my art is in NGA Play, but it's all contextualised through the way I think about things in a way. So I decided to put it all very much based on the Ballet Russe, because I do believe that a lot of people don't know how significant this collection is, and how significant in the world it is, and how wonderful it is in terms of a collection about for young people to think about experimentation and collaboration. Two things that I have: experimentation, I have always done. I've always been a great experimenter, and play. It's always featured in my work. So collaboration, more over the last decade. Especially, I've been taught a lot about collaboration by working with other artists in Indonesia, and also a lot of other artists around the world that I have started various collaborations with, and writers. So with all that in mind, I thought this is a really great project really to do here. So we started the project, and as Rose said, it was about a year ago the discussion started. But I think I pretty much started really about 6 months of really like time to get here, Sally. So we started. And firstly, this is how it starts. A model, and I love models. I make a lot of models. And so from that to a wonderful team that I was working with, and coming up with some ideas that we could start to think about how we could, within our budget as well, work within the space. And I knew that I wanted moving image, as well as some, obviously, references to the costumes. And we decided that we would start to project some imagery onto the onto curtains. And here are various, in my studio, making plans, working with the cut-out elements, working with the dancers. This is a really fantastic model that was made here. Mine are a little more haphazard, but nevertheless, and coming through ideas around colour, and then thinking, well, maybe we'll reduce to black and white, the experience on one side, then colour on the other. And you can see these are some of the plans, putting in the costumes. Some of them my costumes, some of them were costumes, and when I say mine, they're all facsimiles, they're all phototext imagery. And then in my studio, just working backwards and forwards with the team, colours, backwards and forwards, the space, and also, of course, creating the content and the sound. There's a soundscape too. And then back here, I had Rose working on contextualising the costumes through an idea of the felt, because the felt has always been a really strong part of my work as well. And there I am holding up one of the facsimile that went onto the wall, and Annie, my wonderful curator, cutting out felt. And Rose cutting out, and then there's the team there. And there are some of the photographs, which, but you have to go down there and experience it, because this actually has been quite extraordinary. And the capacity here is shadow as well, which you can see through my whole body of work how important the shadow has been. Once again, there's Brooke wearing, I was able to borrow the facsimiles of some of the costumes, not the real costumes, but facsimiles that were made some years ago. And I used the Pierrot costume, and Brooke was dancing in my studio. I had that filmed, and so she performed for me and just did a very, made it in slow motion, which I thought worked really well. And this is an image which is very hot off the press, because that's what I'm working on right now, all summer actually. So it's called the Violet Ballet. It's for the Adelaide Festival. And so what I've done is I'm working with 4 dancers, 1 opera singer, 2 cinematographers, and we're creating a moving image. And also I have a lot of large curtains as well that I've created, all based on shoot. So it's called the Violet Ballet, but it's actually a interpretation of Shoot the Buffoon. Shoot the Buffoon is a very, very difficult work. It's a very violent work. It's 2 Russian fairy tales that hybridise together. And it's very much it's a bit of a Bluebeard story, but a buffoon tricks 7 other buffoons into killing their wives. And so it's quite murderous intent. It's quite dangerous for women. But it's also quite, there's a lot of transformations in there. And I work with Maria Tamarkin, who happens to also be a native Russian speaking, and she's sort of writing a libretto for me, and about how to deal with it has been quite difficult, or I've been trying to work out how to show the violence that I want to show. So it's going to be a 3-channel work where there is scenes of dance, so it's all depicted in a way through improvisational dance, but then I've adjusted the dance to record it in relation to a sort of libretto that won't be sung, but there is a text that gets shown. But then there's also puppets that are all made, and they act out a lot of the violence. But then there is also transformation, and then I've also sort of switched the characters around so that they are sort of multiple characters, so they can be Shoot and the Shoot's wife, but they can be the wife and the Shoot, so everything is sort of mixed up and doesn't take the same sort of trajectory as the story. And I've used the costumes. Parts of the costumes are the ones that I had created, and I have some silkscreen, and they wear them in the performance, in the dance performance that they do for me, in front of the original Laranovo curtains that I have remade with artisans in Indonesia, where I've recut them up, and then they've been resewn, and then I've made facsimiles of them. And this is sort of like a mock-up, really, of how one scene will work. It's the violent scene in dance, and then there's also moving image. There's also a goat in it, and I remember saying to Maria, so I don't get it, how does this goat, what do you mean is a goat that turns into a person? Because in the English translations it would say that the woman turned into a goat, or somebody turned into a goat, but they actually didn't turn into a goat, they pretended to be a goat. But she had to say this in Russian to me, but then she said to me, but what don't you get about turning into a goat, Sally? And I thought, right, it's absurd, of course, it's a fairy tale. But, I mean, that was it, that was the whole point. I mean, it was like she was able to, open it up. But but still, even all the English transcriptions of it still don't make sense. It's a crazy story, but it's actually, it just has captivated me all the way along, and it was the one Laranovo did, so... and these are some of the stills from... Now, I think I have... That's my last slide. So I think I've got it right in terms of timing. Oh, really? Okay. I said I was going to do it fast.
Is that coming? So we do have time for some questions, which I'm sure there's a few, and none have come through on Slido, so I'd like to open it to the floor. Has anyone got a question for Sally? I'd like to start it off because, it has been a tremendous experience working with you, and the NGA play has been enjoyed by, thousands and thousands of people over just this holiday period. You keep coming back to how wonderful it is to be able to use how inspirational the Ballet Russe has been for you to ignite passions in others. Can you perhaps unpack how, the way that you were able to do that with NGA Play?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I wanted to do was that I wanted there to be an environment, to create a strong an environment of I guess all the plays do, but I wanted them to be immersed, it to be immersive in a way. And I thought that moving image would do that, so that it could be a space of immersion in terms of the visuals, and to be strongly visual, and to be strongly connecting to the actual costumes. So we couldn't have the costumes in there, of course, so we've got the documentation of them. But also that there's the link to music and sound, that's important as well. And the creation of simple elements in a way that you don't have to, these things don't have to be complicated. It's really about a degree of experimentation. I mean, really, the drawing on the blackboard and the drawing on paper and the putting on of costumes and making them. It's the simple acts, the simple gestures, and also the sticky tape and the headpieces are also very simple. They don't require a great deal of extra things. I mean, everybody can do them, and I wanted that. I wanted it to be immersive. I wanted you to do that. I wanted you to be able to be in that environment, I think, as much as anything. And in the state of making it the work, we were also very collaborative. We had to work very collaboratively as a team. I mean, it wasn't, I would come with all these ideas, but they had to be worked on, and they were, and it was a great process actually. And how something grows from that was quite amazing, I thought. Yeah.
And one of the other lovely elements that Sally was able to add in was that as part of the opening weekend celebrations, Brooke Stamp actually came in one of Sally's costumes and danced live through the space to the soundscape that was composed especially for the space. So that was a tremendous addition that happened as a special one-off for our audience as well.
Yeah, shown by example, I think, and I think that was. And then many of the children were really involved in that, weren't they? And they wanted to dance as well. And it stimulates that, I think. Yeah.
So we do have a question that's come through on Slido. Bear with me because I'm learning this techno as we go through. Okay. What are your thoughts on textiles and art areas being in two completely different curriculum areas in the Australian curriculum?
Is that right? I don't... I lecture occasionally, but I don't, haven't really, I haven't known that at all, and that's incredible. I just can't believe that. Really? Really? Is that right? So what happens in terms of crossover? How does it matter, or it does matter, or because there's so much crossover? What?
Is there someone, may I hand it to you just to give a bit more context around that?
Possibility. So, I work at ACARA, I'm the arts curriculum specialist, and I'm saying that textiles in art, there is also the opportunity to use textiles within the technology, within the design and technology as a related field, but it's a matter of schools choosing a context, but certainly textiles as part of art making are absolutely fine.
So would it be fair to say that then there's perhaps the potential for people to, or for students to do both subjects in order to really create an in-depth look at textiles within both units? Yeah. Yeah. So sorry, just to sum that up in terms of so that everyone can hear, it really does provide a good foundation for textiles, especially across the junior years. Yeah, cool. Okay, another question that's come through. How much of the sewing and printing did you yourself, and how many people work with you to create your work?
I don't do any sewing. Actually, not quite true. I do a little bit of sewing. I can't sew. I love sewing as a sign, but I actually can't sew myself. In fact, you can see when I've sewn something. It's pretty substandard, but actually quite like that sometimes as well. So I have people who do sew for me, but I do, and I don't print, but I'm always there pretty much at the printing. I'm very hands-on. I mean, I'm extremely much a maker, but because these are large works, I need help. So I do have help, yes. And I have, depending, sometimes I have a couple of people 3 people in Indonesia helping me, and then I have a couple of people in Melbourne as well helping me. Yeah, depends. Sometimes I don't have anyone helping me, so it depends on what I'm working on, really, yes.
And I do know as well with NGO Play, we got very good at sending texts of the little models that we were working on concurrently so that we could interpret and then develop and swap things across as we were all working together remotely too, which is, I suppose, what happens across you and your studio in Yogyakarta as well.
Yes, that's right. Because I talk with my assistant at the studio. I have to. The way we communicate is that there is a lot of imagery that gets created, and so that's PDFs and sometimes just a photograph or just a drawing, and then I just quickly photograph it in WhatsApp. And we in real time, at least more often than not once a day, actually.
Okay, on to our next question. What thinking processes did you use to support you to focus the scope of your thinking to negotiate with the NGA to arrive at NGA play? So I'll just read that again. What thinking processes did you use to support you to focus the scope of your thinking to negotiate with the NGA to arrive at NGA play?
I think all my work, really. I mean, it's a good question because it's, you might not do that as an artist. You might not choose to go that way if you were doing NGA play. It may be but I think that's why the talk, I framed it in a way to show you that there was, this is the background to the work. It's very current, and how I would, I guess the frustration for me was in a way was the fact that there was not to be any artwork. That's the thing that I had to turn off. This is not about me making an artwork. This is about me making an environment, and a spatial environment as well, which is what I do generally anyway. When I do an installation, I'm working with space. So that wasn't difficult, and really I knew the content very well because I've been researching it for about three years. And in fact, the research around the ballet russe and visual artists is very limited. And you may think that's strange, but it actually is true. So the visual arts haven't really been, you have Matisse, you have Picasso, they segue. But it's always been put very much in departments of costume or departments of the collection in terms of here, decorative arts. So visual artists haven't necessarily interpreted it or investigated it quite the same way as that I've been doing it. And there are a few people in the world doing it, and I've reached out to them who are writing about it in the way that I think about it. It's quite different. It's really quite different. So when I say I can't sew, yes, I can't sew. And when I look at the costumes, I am not looking at the beadwork or I'm looking at some of it, but I'm really more interested in when Matisse photographed them together and when they made a line. So it's like an arabesque of one of his works. So it's things like that I'm interested in. So that wasn't actually the costume in relation to the costume in that trajectory or in that history. I'm interested in the sort of the performative mixed with the visual art, and that's sort of quite a different thing in a way. It's not, but it has been historically written about and discussed differently.
Which is perhaps a lovely segue to one of our next questions, which is specifically asking about the work of Matisse and how his cutouts have influenced your work. Yeah,
they totally have. And I remember seeing Matisse's cutouts for the very first time in 1988. It's a long, 89 even, that's a long time ago. 86 actually, it's a really long time ago. And I saw it was in Washington, the first one I saw. And I've since seen it again, but when I saw it, it was huge. It was one of the dancers, I think it was. And but I remember it was quite the response that I had was just a sort of a whole body response. It was emotional and psychological and visceral. I sort of said to myself, I want that. And I didn't know at that time that I would then end up, because I trained as a painter and I made a lot of paintings in my life, and I see myself very much out of that philosophy of painting. And but there was just something so that I wanted from that work. And then years later, of course, that work, when I see it, is so small, as a cutout. It's really small because I've gone, made cutouts that go around whole huge walls and rooms and houses. But also what I found really interesting about Matisse in relation to the Ballet Russe and his work on the Ballet Russe is that those costumes that are in the collection here, he prefigured that, he made those cutouts back in really at the beginning of his career. And like a lot of the artists who were working collaboratively with the Ballet Russe, it was a fraught time. They absolutely had terrible experiences, and they never wanted to go back and do it again. They were also criticised for being in that area. Like, it was the very beginning of, 100 years ago, it was the very beginning of, the chorus line itself, even dance, everything was tainted in a way that these serious painters could not be dealing with this, making the theatre arts. There was a lot of prejudice around this fine artist working in this space. And there was also a lot of fighting and infighting, and there wasn't very much money. And so people were generally quite poor. And no one was being paid, and all the same old problems. But it was just sort of, it was even, and there was war. I mean, this is at a very incredible time in European human history, and a very tragic and traumatic time. So this was all in that environment. So Matisse actually was making the cutouts then and putting them onto costumes. It wasn't until 50s that he actually started to go back into the cutouts.
And we probably only have time for one more question, but it's a good one. When the Ballet Russe performed, their work, especially by Nijinsky, was highly provocative and caused riots. What do you see as today's push-button issues?
For women, so what's the
For-
first bit?
So it's just referring to the fact that Ballet Russe in their time were very provocative,
Oh, right,
and
okay.
they caused riots. What do you see today as the issues that really push people's buttons?
Oh, I think we've got a lot of issues.
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. But I'm a political artist in the fact that I think, all art is political in the end, that you make decisions. They're all political. Decisions are about politics always. For me, it's always been, I have totally a feminist discourse in my work. I always have. And that's been for a really long time, and it'll be ongoing until the rest of my life. They're my politics. And then things come in, of course, they come in. The environment is important. We're crossroads, I think, in terms of environment in a very big way. And I still think representation of diversity and women in our culture is still an absolutely huge issue. And violence against women too. And this has even become even more profound for me as I've been doing this work with the Shoot, the buffoon. Just thinking about, it's dealing with this material. But I'm dealing with it in all sorts of ways, and how I end up, how it ends up being revealed. Art, it is up to interpretation by individuals, obviously, for art, and issues are long, and some issues are short. Art is longer, and so although I will be dealing with all of these things through my brain and through my thinking, how it comes out and then how you receive it is all part of the process. But I do endeavour to make meaning visible, and make some political statements are definitely embedded in there always. But ultimately, you decide that when you encounter the work. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Sally Smart.
Thank you.